Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Page One podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco.
And you just heard the advert for Page One, the writer's notebook, and I'm very excited to say we are fully funded on Kickstarter.
Fully funded, yes.
Fully funded. Start the klaxon.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent news. We're so happy. We've absolutely smashed the target.
Yeah, and there's still time to get your Page One notebook. It's a notebook designed to help you structure and plan your story. It's got templates for characters and things like that. You've got until the 2nd of May at 3:30 p.m, I think it is, British time. So the link's in the bio, so go and grab it.
So who do we have on this week, Marco?
This week we've got Mike Carey, or R Carey is the name he goes under when he's writing his novels. But Mike is perhaps best known for writing comics. He's written for a whole range of comics, including X-Men, Fantastic Four, Lucifer. He did a huge run on Lucifer, which is now a TV show, of course, on Amazon Prime. And he also has done Hellblazer, which is John Constantine. And he's done his own brilliant sort of creator-owned comic like The Unwritten, which we talk about in the podcast. Now, to some of you, you might be saying, I don't like comics. I'm going to turn this off. Please don't, because it's a really interesting chat we had with Mike. And it's really interesting just to hear the different process. And as well as comics, Mike has also written books and screenplays as well. And he talks about the difference in approach for writing for these different things. So I really hope you enjoy the chat. So we'll get straight into it and hope you enjoy it. And we'll be back at the end of the podcast.
See you later.
It seems that you first broke into writing through comics. That was the starting point for you. Is that right?
Well, that's sort of an optical illusion.
Okay.
I spent a lot of my 20s working on novels or things that I thought of as novels. So I started out trying to write prose and failing pretty miserably, really, because I had no real understanding of structure, no sort of instinct for how to make a story shapely. So I wrote these huge, baggy, saggy nonsenses that went on for hundreds of thousands of words, and then in a sort of triumph of hope over experience, I kept submitting them to publishers and getting rejection slips that sometimes read, "You should try writing this as a novel," I got discouraged around about the age of, I guess, 27 or so. I stopped doing that, and I carried on writing because I love writing. But I started doing comics journalism in a very, very small way, just writing reviews for free sheets for fanzines, and then writing sort of slightly longer articles for fanzines, especially for a fanzine called The Fantasy Advertiser,
right,
which was edited by a guy I came to know quite well, Martin Skidmore. He's dead now, sadly. And then through that, I began to meet people who were doing indie comics, and I started submitting pitches and got a couple of pitches accepted. So it was comics where I broke through, but that wasn't where I started in a way.
Right, okay. And where did you first start? Was it 2000 AD that you got your first?
It was not. No.
Not? Okay.
I did the whole thing sort of arse backwards.
Okay.
My French. Am I allowed to swear? Or?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine.
The worse the better.
So there was very, very briefly a rival to 2000 AD called Toxic.
Right.
With an exclamation point at the end, which was published by a publishing entity called Apocalypse Press. We're an offshoot of a comic distributor called Neptune. These were the days before Diamond conquered all. There were 4 or 5 different comic book distributors in the UK, and Neptune was a small but viable one. And they started to do their own line of comics, and I pitched a couple of things to them. Two of the pitches were accepted. One was a superhero story, very much inspired by Watchmen. Actually, inspired is a polite way of putting it. And the other was a sort of psychological horror called Legions of Hell. So they commissioned both of these books, and I wrote about 7 or 8 scripts for them, and then they went bankrupt. Their cost projections were sort of way too optimistic. They thought they could, with 30,000 sales a week, that they could be a competitor to 2000 AD and that they would be viable. And it turned out that they were wrong, and they ceased trading after 31 issues. That was where I broke in, and through that I met a really nice guy, an artist named Ken Meyer Jr., who was an American. He painted in acrylic. He did fully painted art.
Wow.
He was working on the superhero story that never happened, Aquarius. And he introduced me to some people who were working the indie scene in America. And one of those introductions was really sort of fateful. It was to Lorene Haynes, she was married to Dave Dorman, artist of note at that time, and the two of them, Dave and Lorene, were trying to set up an agency for comic creators called Big Time. They never, to my knowledge, they never succeeded in setting the agency up. But Lorene said that she would shop my stuff around, shop my pictures around in the US on spec. And she said, because we're not an agency yet, I'm not going to charge you an agency fee. I'll just show you a work around. So, incredibly kind and generous. And she got me two gigs with Malibu. One was the Ozzy Osbourne comic that I did. And the other was a Pantera comic, a comic starring the heavy metal rock band Pantera. It was not my finest hour. I was into the American indie scene, and through that I ended up working for Caliber for many years. I did a book called Inferno for them, and I did an adaptation of the Dr. Faustus story with Mike Perkins. So those were the sort of stepping stones. It wasn't until after I got Lucifer, after I'd started writing Lucifer, that I kind of doubled back and did some work for 2000 AD.
Okay, right. So that is an unusual route, I suppose, because a lot of comics people in the UK first get their break in 2000 AD, but you've gone to America first and then sort of come back, as you say.
Yeah, I never do anything the easy way.
And how was it that so obviously you said that you wanted to write novels, but then ended up doing comics after doing a bit of comics journalism and stuff. How did you get into that? Did you just give up on the novels for a bit and say, I'm going to try my hand at comics?
Yeah, it was exactly that. My wife, Lynn, claims the credit for that. She says, she said to me at one point, I think she's right, that most of what I was reading for pleasure was comics, which is true. And so, yeah, she said, why don't you try and pitch a comic? And it had never occurred to me. It was like, it's strange, but I sort of saw comics as things that sprang into the world fully formed. I didn't know anybody who wrote for comics. And so I sort of took it for granted that whatever production process there was, it was in a different level of reality than the one that I was on. And it was only through doing the work with Martin Skidmore, for Fantasy Advertiser, that I came to sort of to meet people who were actually working in comics, and to sort of gather up the sort of bottle to try it. And
did you, because everyone, I suppose, in theory knows how to write a book. They sit down and they write it, but a comic has that. A comic script has a structure, a different type of structure, I suppose. Did you? And there are. Yes. It's not that easy to find, or certainly it didn't used to be that easy to find, examples and find guidance on how to do that. Did you manage to get that, or did you just start?
Well, the timing was fortuitous. There was. So this would have been sort of like late 80s, and there were a couple of comic scripts available back then to the curious. One of them, which was the one that I took as my template, was the script for Watchmen 1. Okay. Which was published in the back of the collected edition, for the first collected edition of Watchmen. So I read Alan Moore's script and thought, so that's how it's done then. Which was, in some ways unfortunate, because there is the Alan Moore method, and then there's everybody else, really. So I just assumed that you had to specify every single thing, every visual element in every panel. So I wrote these incredibly long, over elaborate scripts which were fairly turgid and fairly, they were overcomplicated. What Alan Moore does is amazing for him, but is not necessarily the best model for other writers. It took me a long time to realize that if you specify everything in a comic script, you might just as well specify nothing, because you're not telling the artist what to focus on. You're just throwing irrelevant detail at the artist. So my scripts over the sort of the course of the 1990s, they slimmed down from about 10,000 words a pop to about 4,000 to 5,000. And they became more and more fit for purpose. I mean, this is something that strikes me about the whole thing. At the time, when I kept on sort of getting these gigs for publishers who didn't pay me, didn't publish the work, went out of business in the course of the commission, it felt like I was getting nowhere, but I wasn't. It was all really, really useful experience. It's the 10,000 hours thing. You don't sort of jump in and immediately get a sort of intuitive grasp of how to do a thing. You do it by endless iterations. You learn how to do it by endless iterations.
And I suppose, I only know this because I've got an interest in writing comic scripts as well. And I've heard other comic writers say there seem to be different methods, some of which I think are maybe brought on by if you're working on a sort of monthly comic and you've got that tight deadline that you need to get the next issue out. But is it called the Marvel method or something, which is basically, it seems just to be largely an outline that you give the artist and then the artist goes for it. Whereas other people, like you say, obviously Alan Moore's the extreme example, will write every single thing in every single panel. It's a much more collaborative process, I suppose, than writing a novel, for example. You're if you know your artist well, it must be, is it a more sort of even relationship in telling the story?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, when it works well, it is. It kind of depends on how good your editor is too, because the editor is the sort of the conduit between the writer and the artist, or the writer and the art team. So if the editor is doing their job well, then there is communication, and then you build up those relationships. You learn each other's strengths and weaknesses, each other's tricks and quiddities, and you get better at writing for a specific artist. I have worked on some books where the first draft was the last draft, where the editor just took what I sent in and handed it along to the artist without discussion. And those were not great books. As far as different methods of scripting go, I think the Marvel method has more or less died out now.
Right.
It was I say that. I think Cy Spurrier told me once that he does Marvel method sometimes and he really enjoys it. It was an elegant solution to a technical problem, which was that Stan Lee was writing for an entire bullpen full of artists and didn't have time to sort of go into to write full script. So he'd write a précis that would be something like Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus fight in a sewer, and he'd give it to Ditko, and Ditko would go away and draw 17 pages. But the snag of that is that you end up you then dialogue from the finished art. And the pacing isn't necessarily always right.
Yeah.
So you get, it is noticeable if you look at the early issues of the Claremont Byrne and Claremont Cockrum X-Men, that sometimes you get action scenes that are weirdly compressed, and sometimes you get dialogue scenes that go on for way, way too long, and there's nothing really to say. And it's because the art was done independent of the scripting, and then the writer would come back in and script afterwards. It's fascinating to look at things like the Lee Kirby Avengers and Fantastic Four, because when Kirby was drawing from a Marvel method script that Stan had written, he would be drawing in the absence of any dialogue, and he would write in the margins what he thought was being said in the panels. And then Stan would come in and write the dialogue, and usually completely ignore Kirby's suggestions and basically impose a different story and a different pacing on it. It was a strange sort of collaboration, but obviously it worked. And I think you're absolutely right. For it to work, there has to be a give and take. There has to be a flow backwards and forwards between the writer and the artist. If the artist simply takes the assembly instructions for the comic, takes the finished script and draws without reference, without going back to or kicking back against the writer, I think you end up with a fairly inert book often. My best collaborations have been with people with artists who brought their own ideas and their own predilections to the table, so that what we ended up with was not necessarily what was in my head to start with, but was better than what was in my head to start with.
Well, that was what I kind of wanted to ask you about. So you've written screenplays, obviously, for films and for comics, and we'll chat about that as well in a bit. But when you write a screenplay for a comic, you obviously have an image in your head of what it will look like, but then does that change completely sometimes from what you've written down when you have your chat with the artist? Does that how much say do you like to have over the end product if he comes on and says, I think it would be better doing it this way?
Well, I usually start off as a control freak. If I'm working with an artist I don't know, then I write that very full script.
Okay.
And I specify, a lot of detail. I'm sort of like keeping a tight rein on pacing, on page turns, on panel counts, on everything that begins with P. Once I get to know an artist, I'll loosen up. And my scripts for Peter Gross on Lucifer and on the Unwritten, I'll basically say, this is the effect we're going for here.
Yeah.
Get us into hate, go and have a good time. And Peter is a great example of an artist who would take the script as basically the first phase of a negotiation. Rather than as an end point. The example I always use is from Lucifer. We had a character in Lucifer called Christopher Rudd, who was a basically good man, a more or less decent man who had committed one terrible, unforgivable sin. He kills a child, and he kills a child in a moment of rage brought on by jealousy. So he accepts that he belongs in hell. He doesn't sort of aspire to escape or anything. But there's a point in the story where you get this backstory for him. And I wrote it as a 3-page sequence with the normal panel count, 5 or 6 panels per page. And Peter said, the thing about this is he's basically going over those memories every single second of every day that he's in hell. So it doesn't make sense to tell that story only once. We should tell it 100 times. And he turned the pages into these tiny, these sort of like tessellations of tiny panels, which repeated the visual motifs in the story 3, 4, 5, 6 times over. And it was much better as a way of getting that story across. It was much better than what I had.
But that's the thing that comics can do, isn't it? It's that the best comics do that. They have that more than just, here's the story, here's what the people are saying. It's that visual element that can really lift a great comic up from the pack, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a medium where you have different channels of information, but they're coming through to you in the same sense. So if you're watching a movie, that's a terrible way of putting it. If you watch a movie, you hear the soundtrack and you watch the visuals. In a comic, you watch the soundtrack and you watch the visuals. Everything is coming to you through the visual sense, but you have parallel or divergent or convergent paths through that sense. It's unique in that way, I think. You've got your captions and you've got your sound effects and you've got your dialogue, and they're in the visual field. And within the visual field, time turns to space. When you're reading one panel, you're sort of peripherally looking at the panel before and then at the panel after. So rather than following a single second, like a monofilament, as you do in a movie or in a TV show, you're swimming in a lake of moments and of convergent moments, overlapping moments.
Yeah, and that must be, in a novel, you might want to end each chapter on a particular tension point or something so that it leads into the next one. And in a screenplay as well, you do the same with scenes. But with a comic, as you say, because you can kind of see what's coming almost, even if you're not looking at it directly, it takes a different skill to write that, I think.
Yeah, it does. I think this is why Alan Moore went for the 9-panel grid in Watchmen, wasn't it? That he wanted to create the effect of a proscenium arch. If all of the panels are the same size and shape, then the panels become invisible, and you're simply following the thread of the action. It's why I, in a weird way, it's why I had very, very few splashes and spreads in Lucifer, which was my first monthly comic book, because I kind of rebelled against the splash and the spread, because they're cut loose from narrative time. They're moments that you simply you sort of immerse yourself suddenly in this stillness, in this tableau, and it seemed to me very often that you do that at the expense of the forward momentum of the story. So I would always cheat. Shelley Bond was my editor on Lucifer through the entire run, almost the entire run. Mariah Huna took over from her at one point, but Shelley would say, give the artist room to breathe, give the artist spreads and splashes so that they can, they can sort of strut their stuff. But I would always cheat by having a panel at top left or a panel at bottom right to sort of either launch you into it or pull you back into the story after it.
And is there like a difference in your head then between writing something that you come up with yourself or playing in a sandbox of someone else's kind of universe, like X-Men or something? Is there a preference that you have there, or a freedom?
There's certainly there's no preference. They're different pleasures. They really are, and they scratch different itches. I mean, some of the greatest fun I ever had was writing X-Men, because for the simple reason that when I was a child, I really loved those books. Yeah. I sort of grew up sort of immersed in that universe. And then it was X-Men, when I was in my teens, it was X-Men that pulled me back into comics after a period when I didn't read them much. It was Claremont's reinvention of the X-Men that turned me into a regular comics reader again. And so the pleasure of taking those characters and those storylines and adding to them was incredible. After my first ever storyline on X-Men introduced a new group of villains, the Children of the Vault, who were sort of post-humans but not mutants. And about 2 or 3 months into my run, someone sent me a link to a Wikipedia article about the Children of the Vault. And I thought, oh my God, I'm in canon, I'm canonical.
You've made it.
It was a wonderful moment. So that is a great pleasure, I think. And if you're writing in the American mainstream, that's very much the nature of the gig. Most of the work that you do will be with characters who've been created decades before and have been through the hands of numerous creative teams. And so you write both with respect for what's come before and with a sort of an aim to put your own mark on the story as well, to do something with those characters that hasn't been done before, perhaps. But it's also great to create a universe that's just your own. And to sort of like be completely in control of the backstory, of the rules of engagement, and so on.
I was going to ask, when you are working on a book that is a Marvel book or a DC book or something that is long running, do you have meetings that say, right, this is where in 50 issues, this is where we need to be? So you have a little bit of freedom to take us where you want, but these are the sort of blocks that you need to hit along the way.
It's almost the opposite of that. Nobody
okay.
Nobody is looking 50 issues ahead. The only times I've done that is when it was a creator-owned book like The Unwritten. I would in the initial pitch, I'd indicate some things that were going to happen at the end, just to give the impression that I had a sense of direction. But on X-Men and on Ultimate Fantastic Four, the planning was done at most a year ahead.
Right.
And usually like half a year to a year ahead. Marvel would have the creative retreats twice a year. They'd take all of the editors and the writers out to either to New York or to Marvel West, and stick us in a room. And we'd work out the plot beats for the next few issues. it was almost all, the scene in Wallace and Gromit, The Wrong Trousers, where they're on the runaway toy train, and Gromit is laying down the track immediately after the train. It felt like that. There's an exhilaration because really you're just an inch above the road. You're hurtling along, and you're only just keeping things together in the short term. There's very little long-term planning.
That is interesting, and that's almost, that's certainly from modern comics. Is that still the same way now with all the event stuff? I know Marvel went through a big phase of Dark Reign, Secret Invasion, House of M, and it seemed like every year, every 18 months there was a big event, and everything seemed to lead up to that and then fall out from that. Was the planning for that? Was that more of a long-term planning as opposed to just?
Well, the events are the sort of like the structural components of that planning. Mm-hmm. I came on board in the immediate aftermath of House of M, mm-hmm. and we were building up. Well, first of all, we built up to Messiah Complex and then to Second Coming. And along the way, there were things like Secret Invasion, which were not X-Men events. They were line-wide events that some of the X-books keyed into and some of them didn't. And there were many things like that where you could choose which of the things that was coming up you could plug your book into. But even there, you're only talking about a year ahead, a year out.
That's interesting because it always does seem like there's a lot more planning. It seems like they've been planning it for years sometimes, but it sounds like it is just very much off the cuff almost, or more relaxed than it actually is.
That was my experience. Not relaxed, but kind of a ferment of imagination and invention, building up to something that's in the middle distance, not in the long distance. It may well be that the senior editors had more of a sense of the long-term goals. But what we were doing was engaging with a set of ongoing plot lines, building to a climax, which would then create a new status quo and build to another climax, and so on and so forth. It was different. To be fair, it was different at DC, but I never worked in the DC universe. All my work was in Vertigo, and it felt like there was more deliberation there. The pitching process took longer, sometimes incredibly much longer. You'd pitch something, and a year later you'd still be polishing the pitch. And so I guess that's the difference between a franchise, which is a sort of a moving juggernaut, a fast-moving juggernaut, where you've got dozens and dozens of books coming out every month, and a single creator-owned title that you're curating with the aid of one editor.
Well, just moving on from that, on to the Unwritten, which is your creator-owned story. How did that come about? It's a very good hook, I think, the idea. So was it quite an easy pitch to give? I should say to people what the hook is, perhaps, which is that it's a Harry Potter-like character. Is it okay to say that?
I think it's okay to say that. Yeah.
Who effectively comes out of the book into reality. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. Or you have a character who may or may not be a fictional character.
Yeah,
he wants very much not to be Harry Potter, but maybe he is.
Yes.
So what happened there? When Peter Gross and I got to the end of Lucifer, we really wanted to carry on working together. So we started putting pictures in. And this is, I guess, a good illustration of how the Vertigo pitching process worked. We came up with, I'm not exaggerating when I say over a dozen different pitches, which got to different stages of development. In one case, we had a series called Dead Easy, which seemed to be greenlit. We'd worked on many, many different drafts of the pitch. We talked to Shelley about it. We talked to Karen Berger, who was the head of Vertigo, and she talked to Paul Levitz, who at that time was the publisher. And it seemed like it hit everybody's sweet spots, and we were waiting for the green light, and it never came. We were never officially stood down, but the book never got accepted. And And we got discouraged after a long time of doing this, more than a year of doing this. Peter went away and did American Jesus with Mark Miller. I went and did a lot of work for Marvel. And then we were both at San Diego Comic-Con in, I want to say maybe 2007, 2008, around about then. And Pornsak was there. Pornsak Pichetshote, the Vertigo editor, was there. And the three of us met up and we started chatting about stories and things. And Peter had an idea for a story that would follow the same character in real life and in a story. So you'd have a hero, or I think it was a heroine. There's a young girl in the original pitch, and her father was writing stories about her. So you'd see her real life, and then you'd see the idealized version of her life that her father was creating. And I had an idea about the magic trumpet, the trumpet that in Hindu mythology signals the end, brings about the end of one yuga, one age of the earth, and the start of the next. And the idea was that a character finds the trumpet, blows it, and reconfigures reality, and then is trying to find the woman he loved in the previous version of reality. Which actually is a pretty shitty idea when now I come to think of it. But Pornsak said, what if they were the same idea? What if you put both of those things into the same story? And we sort of laughed politely and went away. But then I was reading The Enchanted Places, the first volume of Christopher Milne's autobiography, where he talks about being Christopher Robin in Winnie the Pooh, and what the difference that made in his life, for the worse, not for the better. And that was kind of the cement that brought the two ideas together. I showed it to Peter, and we created a pitch for the Unwritten, which at that time we were calling The Faction. And it wasn't easy to get it accepted. Everybody liked the premise, but we still had to go through, I think it was 6 different drafts of the pitch, and then 6 different drafts of a kind of series overview document. So it took many months still, but Pornsak was determined that it would happen. He just kept on sort of calling us up, putting us together on conference calls so that we could go over it again and again and again. It was very much a three-way collaboration in that case, between the two of us and Pornsak.
Well, I mean, it was good that it eventually got there, because it is a great series.
Thank you.
No, I just read it recently, actually, and really loved it. And then, so comics obviously are what got you the break into writing, but you still obviously harboured that sense that you wanted to write a novel, and you started writing. Was it the Felix Castor series?
Yeah.
You know, how did that come about after your comics, or with your comics work? It was alongside it, I suppose.
It was definitely because of the comics work, because by that point I was writing Lucifer. I was probably about 5 years into Lucifer, and I was also writing Hellblazer. And I showed some of my Hellblazer issues to Darren Nash, who was the commissioning editor at Orbit, and used it as a calling card and said, it would be something like this. And Darren was very much a comics fan, and he was up for me doing a novel, or possibly a series of novels that had some of the flavor of Hellblazer, but with a different protagonist. And I think if you look at the first book, Devil You Know, Castor is basically John Constantine, just with a slightly different style of trench coat. And it's only in the subsequent books that he sort of modulates into his own character, and the world starts to grow and to become its own thing. But it grew out of the work that I did on Hellblazer.
And then, of course, we have to have a chat about the Girl with All the Gifts, which was, of course, the big book that I think a lot of people will know you from, who are perhaps up to date with your work on the comic stuff. And how did that come around?
So that was just incredible serendipity, really. There's an awful lot to be said for being taken out of your comfort zone. So I went straight from comics into novels, and from 2005 onwards, the novels were a sort of as big a part of my creative life as the comics were, in terms of the time I was putting into them. What I hadn't done was short stories, or at least I hadn't done short stories in prose. I loved doing the done-in-one issues of Lucifer and the Unwritten, because in both of those books I was kind of borrowing the structure that Neil Gaiman used so well in Sandman, which was to alternate, and I guess ultimately it goes back to Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, to alternate long arcs with done-in-one issues, and the done-in-one issues would then feed into the sort of the ongoing fabric of the larger work in unexpected ways. So I'd done that in comics, but I'd never done it in prose, and I had a hankering to try it. And then Charlene Harris and Tony Kellner approached me and invited me to write a story for an anthology that they were putting together. And this was an annual event for them. They did it every year. They would do an anthology based around a really banal and everyday and harmless theme. Like one year it was family vacations, another year it was home improvements, and this year it was school days. And I created the character of Melanie in a short story named Iphigenia and Alice. And it was really just the first few chapters of the novel, up to the point where the base falls apart. Wrote it, sent it in. It was well received. It was actually nominated for a couple of awards, including a Derringer Award, which is a short mystery fiction award. But I couldn't put the character down. And I couldn't put the voice down. I was just convinced that there was something more to be told here. And so I went to my publishers and asked permission not to write the book that I was commissioned to write next, which was a mainstream conspiracy thriller. I said, I want to write this book instead. And they took a bit of convincing initially, but they did like the short story. And so eventually they said, yeah, okay, fair enough, do it. And I wrote Girl with All the Gifts. And at the same time, I pitched the same idea to a producer who I was working with, Camille Gatan, and that's how the movie came about. So the movie is not really an adaptation of the novel. They're both adaptations of the short story.
And you were writing those at the same time, is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, how did you do that? How do you write a book and a screenplay at the same time, even if it is the same story? It's not, you know.
It was surprisingly easy, because for that very reason, because they are so different. Because basically every medium is a different toolbox, and it does different things in different ways. Working on two different versions of the story kind of clarified what were the key turning points, the key moments that the story had to be built around. So each version made the other one easier. Having said that, movies have a different gestation period than novels. The novel came out in January 2014. We didn't go to principal photography on the movie until May of 2015. So there was a year and a half after the novel came out, 2 years or more after I'd finished writing the novel and handed in the final draft, when I was still working on the movie and still thinking about those characters and still thinking about the way to articulate that story. And I think some of the later scenes in the movie are better than the corresponding scenes in the book, especially the final confrontation between Melanie and Caldwell. I just think it articulates better in the movie. But that's how it happened. It was just the happy accident of being asked to write this story, having no idea at all how to get into it, trying something completely different, and it worked.
And then I wanted to ask about the sequel, The Boy on the Bridge, and how did this come about? Was this because obviously it is obviously the same universe as The Girl with All the Gifts, and there's a link to it, but it's not really a direct sequel, I suppose. I don't want to spoil it necessarily, but how did you? Was it something you had in your head, or was it? Did you? Were you asked to do a sequel and you thought, well, how would I fit one in, and tried to work out a way to do it?
It certainly wasn't in my head when I wrote Girl. I thought Girl was done in one. And so the next thing I wrote after that was Fellside, the prison drama, the ghost story set in a women's prison. So I had no intention of writing a sequel or of revisiting that world. But it was kind of hard not to, having spent so long on the movie, having sort of carried on lingering in that world, and actually getting to step into that world as an extra in the movie. I just kept on thinking about it and kept on thinking about what else could you do with that situation. And I I emphatically didn't want to write a sequel, because what happens at the end of Girl with All the Gifts is such a game changer for that world. You would have to write, the sequel would have to be in a completely different genre. It would be a story about the foundation of a new world. But I thought that there was room for a story that would, well, there's a point when you're writing a novel where you start to narrow down toward the ending, toward the climax. When you're writing the early chapters and you're laying out the world, there's a sense of expansiveness, and you're just like following up all these ideas and putting in all this furniture. And then there's a point where you have to sort of stop with all that nonsense, and you have to start bearing down and sort of heading towards the ending and making the ending work. And when you're in that second phase, there are a lot of things that go untold because there isn't any room for them. And in Girl with All the Gifts, one of the things that's untold is, what the hell is this huge mobile laboratory just doing, standing in the middle of nowhere with the keys in the ignition? How did Rosie come to be there with a single dead body in the cockpit, who may even have committed suicide? And I thought you could tell that story in a way that kind of illuminated Melanie's world from a different angle. And then I thought I could also cheat and do a tiny bit of a sequel. So right at the end of Boy on the Bridge, you get a glimpse of what the world is like after Melanie. So it was that, really. It was something that allowed me to go back into that world where I had such a good time and do something different with it. But it wasn't planned. All
your work has a tinge of horror around it, I suppose, albeit not in the sort of in-your-face type horror. Even Girl with All the Gifts has zombies in it, but I wouldn't have really categorised it as a horror film or anything like that. But is that the sort of world that you always want to? You always have an element of that in your stories?
I think that there's always some. My comfort zone is fairly wide. It goes all the way from horror through dark fantasy into sort of classic fantasy, into science fiction, into magic realism even. What I can't write is, I can't write outside of genre. I can't do mainstream literary fiction. I have tried just for my own sort of amusement, and it doesn't work. It feels like I'm painting in black and white instead of in color. I love genre, but I love that whole sort of expanse of genres, and I love that we live in an age when the labels matter less than they did, when it's possible to do genre fusion and not even apologize for it. So I think you're right about Girl with All the Gifts. It's got zombies in, but they're plague zombies. They're not magic zombies. They're not undead supernatural zombies, and the rationale is a scientific rationale. So it's sci-fi. It's a dystopian, post-apocalyptic, futuristic sci-fi novel that is also a zombie novel, and that isn't even rare now. That's a subgenre of zombie fiction now. I think quite an established one.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I think it is, certainly from my point of view, because it's what I like as well. It's very refreshing that there isn't that snootiness that there perhaps once was. That something has to be literary to be worthy of praise. Genre stories can be great and can be literary as well, but they're not looked down on in the way that they once were.
I think some of the most vital and some of the most significant work that's being done is being done in genre.
I saw there was a quote from Ian McEwan today, actually, that was somewhat snooty about science fiction. So,
but it's interesting because you have a look at stuff that's big in the cinema right now, and you've got the Avengers on one hand, and you've got Logan on the other, and they're both completely different films, but they're both tied in that kind of comic universe, and they're both massive successes. Yeah, it's still kind of strange to think that these films and this kind of genre element is so big right now, when 10, 20 years ago it was. No, it was on the sidelines almost.
I think we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to Peter Jackson. If it hadn't been for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I don't think there would have been the appetite at studio level to put all this sort of money and all this risk into long form comic book narrative in cinema, and that's what we're getting. For the first time, we're getting cinema storytelling that is as complex and convoluted as the stories are in the comics themselves.
Multiverses and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's absolutely fantastic. As a fan of that stuff, it's fantastic, absolutely.
And in terms of films, are you working on any? I think you said you were working on a screenplay at the moment. Is that right? I
am. Yes. I don't think I'm allowed to announce it. Well, actually, I'm working on two, and I can talk about one of them. So one of them is a collaboration with some American production entities, and it's based on an existing IP, an existing story. And I don't think I can announce that. But the other movie that I'm working on is based on Fellside.
Oh, right.
The ghost story that I wrote in between Girl with All the Gifts and Boy on the Bridge. I'm doing that with development money from the BFI, and working once again with Colin McCarthy, who was the director of Girl with All the Gifts, and Camille Gatan, who was the lead producer on Girl with All the Gifts. So it's wonderful to be sort of collaborating with them again. They're amazing people and just brilliant to work with.
When you do write, is there any rules that you try to stick by? You know, everyone knows the write what you know type things, but is there anything that you like to stick with?
I can speak to write what you know, because obviously there's a sense in which if you've written a novel that's a ghost story set in a women's prison and you're a guy and you're alive, you're probably not writing what you know. I think write what you know is a little bit of a death trap, because it shouldn't mean write about your own experience in a sense of, you know, write about the people and the settings that are familiar to you. I think what you know is people. You use the relationships you've had. You use your real people as the basis for your fictional creations, and that's what gives life to them and makes them feel, if you're doing it right, makes them feel convincing. But you can write when it comes to plot and setting and theme. The hell with what you know. It's fiction. Spread your wings and write about anything. I think go as far outside what you know as you possibly can.
Yeah, I think that's right. We were speaking to another author recently, Adrian J. Walker, who wrote The End of the World Running Club, and he was saying very much the same sort of thing, that, you know, it's writing, it's taking, you know, if you have an emotion that you can bring to a story or an observation, but it's not, you know, I've worked in an office, so my story has to be writing about offices and things like that. Definitely.
Yeah. There's a great quote from G.K. Chesterton where he's talking about miracles in fiction, and he said basically, so long as you set it up, the audience will accept any miraculous coincidence, any preposterous and unlikely event. What will kill your story in a second is a moral miracle, a character doing something that the audience know that character would not do. If you cross that line, then you lose everything.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true, and I think we've all seen stuff on TV or read stuff where someone does something because the plot says they have to be in A to B, and you know that doesn't feel right, and even if you don't understand why, it just doesn't feel right on a base level, and it does lose you.
It just takes you out of the story.
Exactly, yeah.
You saw it on Lost. I mean, I was a big fan of Lost, but it really annoyed me how in the later seasons a crisis would come up, and it would be like every character would state a position in relation to that crisis, and it would always just be done to create maximum drama, and therefore they would just go against everything they'd stood for the last time for the sake of the surprise this time.
Yeah, I mean, Lost is an example of, like, I loved Lost, certainly the initial series, you know, the start of it, but they obviously never quite had a plan, despite what they said.
Yeah.
And at the end, they were just throwing lots of sort of, this is a mystery, without ever any intention of answering it all, which ended up being quite frustrating, really.
By contrast, and this is a small example, but I really love the moment in Civil War when Captain America refuses to sign the Registration Act. because he's the one guy who you would expect to have the respect for authority, to toe the line.
Yeah.
But actually, the authority he respects is bigger. It's bigger than the government. It's a commitment to an ideal, and he will defy any lower authority in order to hold faith with that ideal. It's the perfect beat for him. It's really surprising, and then you think, yeah, but it's inevitable.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. I think he's actually a perfect example of someone, especially when they bring him, in his first kind of outing, he's fighting the Nazis, and it's very kind of easy to know what side he's on. And then when they bring him back into the modern world, it would be very easy to say, right, now you fight on the side of America as it is now, and that's that. But they take a much more interesting approach with him and say, no, actually, the America that he knows has changed, and he is the same person he's always been, but it's the America that's changed and has actually in some ways become the enemy. And that I thought was a really interesting way to keep him relevant and not just make him the kind of poster boy for whatever America's doing.
Yeah, it's brilliant in Civil War. It's brilliant in Winter Soldier when he has that argument about surveillance with Nick Fury.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that is probably the difference, isn't it, between the Marvel films and the DC films, and that they've got the characters, and the characters stick to what they're meant to be doing, whereas the DC ones haven't, at least in the initial ones, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, but Batman branding people.
Yeah, exactly. Branding so that they get killed, exactly. Missing the point of the character somewhat, I would have said. But
I think it's a shame in a way that Dark Knight was such a great success. I mean, it was a deserved success, but they seem to have spent the next decade just basically trying to do the same thing again and again and failing again. Yeah.
Not understanding that other characters aren't, Superman doesn't need to be grim and gritty like Batman was.
Yeah.
It's a different sort of thing, but they seem to be steadying the ship a bit, I think. I've heard Shazam's good.
I saw it yesterday.
I'm curious.
It was my favourite of the DC stuff lately, definitely.
Yeah, I'll definitely be checking that out.
And this is maybe a silly question given your prolific output, but do you ever suffer from writer's block?
Well, I have good days and bad days. I mean, there are definitely days when I spend way too long looking out of the window. The best advice I was ever given as a writer was, if you can't do it wrong, if you can't do it right, do it wrong. Mm-hmm. So don't stare at the blank page. Get something down, however awful it is. And then when you got it down, look at it and think, well, that's awful because, and that'll sort of point you in the right direction.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So as my solution to writer's block is to just put down some blather, and then critique it.
And what's in the future for you then? Are you going to continue playing in all fields, in the comics and the books and the screenplays? Or is there anything else you'd like to work on?
I found my limits, I think, because I have tried. There are some forms of writing that I've tried and failed miserably at. I've done a couple of radio dramas.
Okay.
And I think it's fair to say they were awful. And I've done I tried to write for games a couple of times. And I just find writing for games incredibly frustrating because very often you're trying to create a sort of a polysemic space where lots and lots of different stories are inscribing themselves. And I can't let go of control to that degree. So I know what I can't do, or at least I know some of the things I can't do. I would love at some point to write for theatre, but I don't know how you go about doing that. Mm-hmm. Apart from that, I'm happy to sort of to keep on working in all the different fields that I do write in, because I think picking up and putting down different media, moving from comics to prose to screenplays back to comics, I think it helps to keep you fresh. Because you're using different skill sets and you're using different storytelling strategies. What I want to avoid is the situation where I'm just telling the same story again and again, and I think that's an easy trap for a writer to fall into. Yeah. Because you're the last person to know. Other people will spot your recurring themes and your obsessions long before you do. You'll think this is radically different when actually all you've done is change the color of the fabric on the furniture. So yes, I want to carry on working in different media.
And are there any existing, long-standing comics properties that you would like to have a play in that you haven't done yet?
Not really, no. I think probably my days of working on big franchise books are over and done with. I did genuinely love writing on X-Men, and I loved writing on Ultimate Fantastic Four, but it's a specific kind of commitment. In order to write for an X-Men book, you've got to be up on what's happening in all the other X-Men books, and to a certain extent, you've got to be up on everything else that's happening in the Marvel Universe.
Yeah.
And keeping your antennae out like that is a big outlay of time. And now there are just so many other things that I'm doing. I don't think I would be able to do that. And I'm way behind in both the DCU and the Marvel Universe. I've got no idea what's going on there currently. So it would take an enormous commitment up front to get back into a sort of a position of sort of knowing what was what, knowing where everything was. It's kind of like trying to jump on board a moving train. Mm-hmm. I'm not young enough.
Well, I'm always amazed at someone like Grant Morrison when he did his run on the Batman comics, how he brought in aspects of the whole of Batman's history. How you can even begin to try and tie all of that and get on top of all of that is beyond me. But it worked in a sort of mad Grant Morrison way.
I didn't understand it at all at the end, but it was very compelling.
Actually, since you mentioned Grant Morrison, there is just maybe one franchise property that if it was offered me, I wouldn't be able to say no to, and that's Grant Morrison era Doom Patrol. Mm-hmm. If there was a chance to tell a story against that backdrop, with Robot Man and Crazy Jane and Rebus and Niles Calder, I might very well try and do that. But having said that, I think he's an impossible act to follow. I think if you step onto a book after Grant leaves it, your choice is to try and be Grant, in which case people will hate you, or to do something different, in which case people will hate you.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You want to leave it a couple of creators before you step back into that one. Well, we like to wrap up every podcast with sort of quick-fire questions. So if we can give you some.
Okay.
Batman or Superman?
Batman, I think, yeah.
Star Wars or Star Trek?
Star Trek, especially Next Generation.
Excellent choice.
A real book or an e-book?
Real book. Books have got a smell of something.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
So what about the convenience of being able to just have 1,000 books in your pocket and going on a holiday?
It's great for holidays and it's great for research. It's shit for everything else.
Fair enough. Get Out or Us?
Oh, that's a tough one. Marginally Us.
Oh, really?
But maybe that's just because I saw it more recently.
I have to say, I thought his first film was miles better than I didn't really get on with Us very much at all.
It's crazy and it's structurally it's weird. It takes some tonal shifts along the way that are hard to fathom. But I just thought Lupita Nyong'o is
she was fantastic.
Perfect
No,
in both those
true.
roles.
Yeah.
And last one, Walking Dead or Game of Thrones?
Game of Thrones.
Correct.
Have you watched the first episode yet?
No, but I may be getting my hands on a bootleg later today. So
excellent. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I really enjoyed chatting to Mike.
Yeah, really nice guy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a big comic fan, so it was really great to have the chance to speak to him in depth like that. And just really interesting to hear how it is that he manages to write across these different mediums, from comics to books to screenplays, and how each one kind of helps the other.
Yeah, and for me, I know him more from The Girl with All the Gifts rather than the comic stuff that he's also done. So I found it really interesting, the way that he'd written the book and the screenplay at the same time, and one informed the other, and the way it almost helped him realise what was important about the story. It's obviously not everyone can do that, but it's a really good way to see it.
It was interesting, wasn't it, that they're the same story, but they're not the same story.
Yeah.
They ended up being different in some ways, and when you're starting from the same point, it's quite funny how that can be the case.
I think that's right. And I suppose when you're writing a film, we've said before on the podcast that you don't have any of the inner kind of character stuff. So that's more of a book thing. But when you've got the book fleshing out the characters so well, that must make it a lot easier to write them on the screen.
Yeah. And writing about comics as well, I thought, there's these different methods. I mentioned the Marvel method, which is this sort of basic outline method, which Stan Lee invented, but it sounds like has largely died out. But even the medium is a different thing. And it's maybe something that people that don't read comics a lot fully get. But there is that thing that, as he was saying, you've always got the next and the last panel in your vision. So the best comic writers will take advantage of that and tell the story through the page, even knowing that you can see what's about to happen. Absolutely. And things like that.
We've all read a bad one where suddenly something is completely spoiled because you've seen the image before you really should have. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the best ones take advantage of it. Like he was giving that example from Lucifer about the 100 different occasions in hell, repeating and repeating and repeating. That's something that comics as a medium can do that not even film can really do. It is its own medium. Absolutely. And really interesting.
And you compare something like that to something like Watchmen, and they look completely different. The panel layout was totally different, and there is a lot more scope there than people realise, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And a big Game of Thrones fan as well, by the sounds of it.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. Have you been watching the new series?
I have. I've seen the first 2 episodes now, so enjoying it, all ready for the Battle of Winterfell.
Yeah, I have to say, I've 2 episodes in as well, 4 left to go. I can't see where it's going from here. Is it going to all wrap up with the final battle? Is it just going to be 4 episodes of fighting?
I think it might be. There'll certainly be a lot of death.
Yeah, I'll be surprised if that many people get away from next week, never mind at the end of the season.
Exactly. Well, we can see where we are after next week's episode, but I imagine probably half the cast will be dead. But who have we got on next week?
Next week we have Helen Fitzgerald, who is the author of The Cry. You may have seen that on TV. It was adapted into a BBC drama.
Yeah, it was good, but as a parent, pretty distressing, I have to say.
Yeah, the book is excellent. The setup for the book, the first act is one of the most impressive first acts I've read for a while. I read it on a plane, and yeah, it's just it really grabs you, and it's a really, really good book.
Yeah, so we're looking forward to speaking to Helen about that. Thanks, as always, to Simon Stokes for his production assistance. If you're wanting to get in touch with us, you can tweet us at right_gear, and you can email us at podcast@rightgear.co.uk.
But until next week, we will leave you with one last little advert for page 1. The Writer's Notebook, remember, it's on Kickstarter. You've still got just under 1 week left, so please do go up there. If we get our stretch goal smashed, you'll get more colours options, so there's still a lot to play for.
Yeah, and the link is in the bio, as we say, so you can just click that and you'll see what it's all about. But have a good week, and we'll speak to you next week.
See you later.